expert on PN. He is a professor of neurology and director of the neuromuscular division of Johns Hopkins University Hospital Medical School. He's not only a medical expert on PN, but he's a very accessible and responsive person. He disguises his expertise with a very down-to-earth and pleasant demeanor. Dr. Hoke, the floor is yours until 8 p.m. or so, and then we'll turn it over for questions. Dr. Hoke, welcome.
Thank you, Steve, Pat, Eleni, and Judson. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen. And let's put this on. So, today we were discussing about how to structure this talk, and I've asked Steve and others what the support group patients would like to hear. And given that we have a mixture of both veterans as well as newbies, people with new diagnosis of peripheral neuropathy, I thought I would give a little bit of an overview of what peripheral neuropathy is and what you expect, and how we approach patients when we see them in our clinics. And then talk a little bit about some exciting research that's happening that is still at the preclinical stage, but it's going to move into clinical trials very rapidly over the next couple of years. So what is peripheral neuropathy? When I see a patient in my clinic that has numbness, tingling in their hands and feet, one of the first things that I talk to them about what a peripheral nerve is. Neuropathy means disease of the peripheral nerves. And think of your peripheral nerves as literally like the wiring in a house. It connects your spinal cord and brain, which is like the electrical panel in your basement, to the rest of the house, to the rest of your body. And they come in different types of sizes, and they have different functions. You have the motor nerve that goes to your muscles and allow you to control your muscles and your strength. You also have two different types of sensory nerve fibers. You have ones what we call proprioceptive or large sensory nerve fibers, and these are the ones that go to your muscles and your joints and give you the perception of balance. Even if you close your eyes, you know your hand is where it is in space, and the same thing with your nerves in the legs, and that helps maintain your balance. When those nerve fibers are abnormal, you have trouble with your balance and you almost walk like a drunk. But most of the time, peripheral neuropathy starts in these nerve fibers, what we call the small sensory nerves that goes to your skin and is responsible for your perception of the external environment. They sense touch, temperature, pain, and so forth. And in most peripheral neuropathies, these are the ones that are affected first. And those nerve fibers are often sometimes difficult to diagnose because the standard testing, such as nerve conduction studies, may not show any abnormality. And then the fourth group of nerve fibers are autonomic nerves. These are the ones that goes to your internal organs and are responsible for your bodily functions. So when the autonomic nerve fibers are affected, you may experience all sorts of unusual sensations. You may experience trouble with your bodily functions, such as persistent nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, or trouble with blood pressure maintenance, controlling your urine or bowels, and so forth. So the other thing I want to mention, and you will probably hear about inflammatory neuropathies and how that differs from, say, idiopathic neuropathies, is this issue of axon versus myelin. Your peripheral nerves are literally like the electrical wire. The axon is actually the extension of the nerve cell starting from your spine going all the way down. And so it's a single cell, and that's like the equivalent of the copper portion of the wire. Myelin is the insulation around the nerve fibers, and that allows the electricity to be conducted through the nerve much more efficiently. And certain diseases, and these are relatively rare types of neuropathies that affect the myelin. The majority of the time, 99% is going to be the axon degeneration that's going to give you the symptoms. So here's another kind of a high power view of your peripheral nerve. Peripheral nerves is basically this big bundle in each nerve, like let's say this is your sciatic nerve. There are individual bundles that go into different muscle groups. And within each bundle, which we call these fascicles, you have both motor and sensory nerve cells, or the axons with their myelin. So here's a classical example of a patient that I saw several years back. This middle-aged woman presented with 3 years history of slow onset burning sensation in her feet. It was also associated with some numbness sensation. The symptoms were worse in the evening. Whenever she tried to go to sleep or watch TV, the burning would become more prominent. She had some cramping in her feet. But other than that, she didn't have any balance issues. She didn't have any weakness, no autonomic symptoms. And her examination was really consistent with her symptoms, in the sense that she had what we would, and I'll show it to you, what we call a stocking and glove distribution, decreased sensation to pinprick, light touch, and temperature up to the ankles. But the rest of her examination was relatively unremarkable. So how do we work up these patients? It's really unfortunate that by the time patients come to see us, they often get an MRI scan, and this is almost always unnecessary. I have yet to see a patient where the MRI has been really useful in the evaluation of peripheral neuropathies. But the rest of the time, patients do need EMG nerve conduction studies to evaluate what we call the large fibers, the motor fibers and large proprioceptive sensory fibers. And in her case, they were normal because her symptoms were consistent with what we call small fiber sensory neuropathy. And in patients like her, what we do is we do a skin biopsy, and that's what we saw, was that she had evidence of degeneration of her nerves around the ankle, but more proximally, they were normal. And her blood workup showed that she had abnormal oral glucose tolerance tests. That is, she was actually pre-diabetic, and that was the cause of her neuropathy. So what I want to highlight is this whole issue of why the symptom starts in your feet. And that has to do with the length. In your body, your peripheral nerve, as I said, sit in your spinal cord, the cell body of the nerve cell, and it extends this long extension, which we call the axon, and you have the myelin around it. In most peripheral neuropathies, you have this process called slow axon degeneration that starts in the distalmost part. There are many reasons for this. Part of it is problem with the mitochondria, as well as some of the other components of axon transport. But mainly the issue is this degeneration that starts slowly in the longest axons is what gives patients the symptoms. And I'm not going to talk about some of the other more rare types of peripheral neuropathies that we see, because I don't think anybody had some of these other rare issues. Again, when I see a patient, I always talk about, peripheral neuropathy is a very generic term. There are literally over 100 different types of peripheral neuropathies and different causes of peripheral neuropathy, but probably diabetic neuropathy, which is about 50%, and then idiopathic peripheral neuropathy, which is about 30%, covers majority of the patients. And the pattern of symptoms is what we talk about, the stock and glove distribution. That is, it starts in the feet. As the disease progresses, it goes up. And by the time it reaches the knees, the distance from your lumbar spine to the knee is almost the same as from your neck down to your hands. That's why you start to see symptoms in your hands. There are other rare types of neuropathies where it can affect the whole body, or it can affect individual nerve bundles. And today, one of the participants asked about postherpetic neuralgia, which is basically shingles causing nerve damage. And I'll come back to that, but that's basically a variant or variation of this single mononeuropathy. So what are the symptoms of peripheral neuropathies? As I mentioned, it really depends on the different domains affected or the different nerve fibers affected. You know, most of you are likely to have the sensory small fiber involvement. So you may experience different types of pain. This could be pins and needles, electric shock-like sensation, or burning, deep aching sensations. But at the same time, the same foot may also feel numbness or lack of sensation or a pressure sensation. When the large nerve fibers are affected, as I mentioned, you're going to have poor balance. With the motor nerve fiber involvement, you get muscle wasting and weakness. And this is really rare for the most types of peripheral neuropathies. You may also experience some cramps. Fasciculations are little muscle twitches. And when the autonomic nerve fibers are affected, you get trouble with your blood pressure control, erectile dysfunction in men, trouble with sweating or sweating too much, diarrhea or constipation. So why is it important to study this? As Steve mentioned, this is a very, very common disease. It is actually the most common neurodegenerative disease, yet it doesn't get the same attention as, say, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, MS or ALS gets. And one of the reasons it doesn't kill people. You know, I think that's the reason. It makes people's lives miserable at times, but it's not a sexy disease to study, and NIH funding is actually quite limited. So there are many causes. As I mentioned, the diabetes and prediabetes is probably the most common cause. Idiopathic is the second big group. And then the rest are due to a bunch of other things. You know, uremia means people with chronic kidney disease, elevated uremia. We don't really see this anymore because most patients with kidney disease that are that advanced get hemodialysis or kidney transplants. One thing I want to mention is the alcohol. I always get asked this question when I see a patient. You know, a moderate amount of alcohol is fine, but there has been multiple studies that show that if you drink the equivalent of 2 glasses of wine or 2 shots of whiskey for more than 20 years, in a susceptible genetic background, your risk of neuropathy increases tremendously. If you drink alcohol even less than that, but develop neuropathy from, say, diabetes or from idiopathic causes, my recommendation is usually to moderate the alcohol intake to no more than perhaps 2 or 3 glasses of wine a week. And I think that is a prudent thing to do because you have already a neuropathy from something else. You don't want to accelerate the degeneration of your nerves and develop more severe problems. Chemotherapy drugs are important. The other causes, toxins, are extremely rare, and usually there's some sort of a, occupational exposure to those. So how do we work up patients with peripheral neuropathy? As I mentioned, we do nerve conduction studies, electromyography. I'm sure all of you have gone through this. This is the first step in kind of teasing out, is this a problem with the axon or is it a problem with the myelin or the insulation around the nerves? Because that determines how we treat neuropathy, because demyelinating neuropathies by and large are caused by your own immune system attacking the myelin in the nerves, and theoretically they can be stopped with immunosuppressive therapies and allow the body to repair the myelin. The body can't really repair the axon, but can repair the myelin. In patients where EMG nerve conduction studies is normal, like our patient that I mentioned, the next step would be to do a skin biopsy. And this way we can actually see these individual nerve fibers in the skin. We stain for it, we can evaluate, we can count the numbers, we can look at the morphology. In fact, these swellings are often signs of degeneration of those nerve fibers. You know, I'm going to probably skip this part because there's other rare types of investigations that can be done if patients have autonomic testing. If they have autonomic symptoms, we can do autonomic testing. Nerve and muscle biopsies nowadays are rarely done except to look for inflammation or look for an abnormal protein called amyloidosis if the blood tests indicate that that might be the case. But 90% of the patients that I see in the clinic, or 95, doesn't need any of these investigations except blood work to rule out underlying etiologies. So this is probably the most important slide for most of you. I wish I could tell you that we have actually disease-modifying therapies or things that we could do to prevent the axon degeneration from progressing. We don't right now, but hopefully that's going to change. The only thing I want to really emphasize is how important exercise is. Now there has been several large studies done in hundreds of diabetic patients or patients with pre-diabetic neuropathy, and a rigorous exercise regimen of about half an hour of aerobic exercise, low impact aerobic exercise combined with half an hour of resistance training with weights or elastic bands can slow the degeneration. So in one of these studies, they actually did baseline biopsies and then repeated that after 6 months and demonstrated that those patients, some of them had slowing, and in fact, a couple of patients, they noticed that there was absolutely no progression of the disease. And this is important because even in diabetic patients with good diabetes control, their neuropathy progresses. We don't really understand why that's the case, but clearly other factors play a role. And in fact, in diabetic patients with metabolic syndrome, the hypertriglyceridemia or elevated triglycerides and lipids seem to be a big risk factor for progression of the neuropathy, even when the diabetes is well controlled. I'll come back to some of these treatment paradigms, especially when we're doing the Q&A session. But for focal conditions such as postherpetic neuralgia, which is pain due to shingles, topical applications sometimes can be helpful, lidoderm patches or compounded creams, or people who have pain only in their feet, compounded creams can also be helpful. The only problem with both of these approaches is that the clinical trial data isn't very strong. Nevertheless, they don't have any side effects. And I usually tell patients, go ahead and try it. Even if it works as a placebo, then maybe it will be helpful. It's the same thing with the nutritional supplements such as alpha lipoic acid and others, and I'll come back to that. The problem with all of those is there is no good randomized placebo-controlled study that shows that they are better than placebo arms in those studies. The data where we have is primarily in the two classes of anti-neuropathic pain medications, which is anti-epileptic drugs such as gabapentin, or also known as Neurontin, Lyrica or pregabalin, as well as several different classes of antidepressants, such as the old ones, what we call tricyclic antidepressants, amitriptyline and nortriptyline, or the more recent ones such as duloxetine or Cymbalta. These don't work for everybody, and they have a lot of side effects. So it's a balance between the potential side effects and how much the patient is uncomfortable with their symptoms. I try to avoid opioids because the body gets used to it and you end up needing more and more. And they don't work that well for typical neuropathic pain from the peripheral neuropathy. Obviously, biofeedback is a non-pharmacological approach. It works in some people who have relatively mild neuropathy. The other thing I recommend is people who have balance issues is to refer them to physical therapy for gait evaluation and balance training exercise that patients learn to do, but also they can do Tai Chi. It's a great exercise, and clinical trials have shown that it really helps balance problems in diabetic neuropathy patients with balance issues. So how is, we talked a little bit about the different workup that we do. The most important thing is really a series of blood tests, ruling out diabetes, ruling out vitamin B12 deficiency, ruling out amyloid problems with looking for monoclonal gammopathies. We test for HIV and do a test called SED rate that's looking for markers of inflammation. Often I will order one of these more sensitive tests looking for diabetes rather than looking just fasting blood glucose levels. Hemoglobin A1C is a test of average of your glucose in the preceding 3 months, whereas the 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test is a very sensitive way of looking at how well your body handles sugar overload that normally happens with your meals. In pre-diabetic patients, they may have normal fasting blood glucose levels, but when you challenge them you ask them to drink a sugary water, their body blood glucose levels shoot up higher than it should, and it doesn't come down as fast as it should. So one of the really interesting things in the last literally in the last 6 months is 2 papers that have been identified where we now know about a third, this is a huge number, about a third of idiopathic peripheral neuropathies are probably genetic. One of these is mutations in this one gene called RFC1. This is still not commercially available test, but it is it's a research tool where several groups around the country are racing to replicate this one paper that was published this summer to see if it is truly a third of all idiopathic patients are genetic and it's due to these. And in this one paper where they looked at about 240 patients, none of those patients had any family history. So it's clearly, these are just spontaneous mutations in a gene. And this test, this mutation in this gene isn't easily testable with the standard genetic panels, which we normally do with most of our patients. So in the next 10, 15 minutes, I really want to give you guys some hope because there's some really exciting stuff happening in the research side of things. So we talked a little bit about axon degeneration, and as I said, this dying back axon degeneration that we see in peripheral neuropathies. But there's another type of axon degeneration or nerve degeneration, that is the traumatic nerve injury. So when you cut your nerve, if like in an accident, the distal part of this nerve degenerates, but the proximal part stays intact. And in fact, it starts to regrow back. And that's known as Wallerian degeneration. And Wallerian degeneration was something that was described by Augustus Waller more than 150 years ago when he was experimenting with frogs. And this is one of the advantages of the peripheral nerve compared to the central nervous system, is that the Schwann cells, the ones that make up the myelin in the peripheral nerve, actually proliferate and create an environment for the peripheral nerve to regenerate. So your peripheral nerve has the ability to regenerate if we can figure out a way for it to stop from degenerating. And that's the, there was a question, I think, from Steve, and I'll come back to that. He was asking, are there any neuropathy types that can actually be reversible? So, Wallerian degeneration, why is this important? So for the first 150 years or so after Waller described this phenomenon, nothing really was, there wasn't any major advancement in the field until this British researchers back in 1989 found that in their colony of mice, there was one mouse type that when you cut their nerves, it didn't degenerate. So they call this slow Wallerian degeneration mouse. Typically with the wild type mice, when you when you crush the nerve, you get this degeneration rather than, this is a picture of your peripheral nerves. Each individual axon is here. The black area is the myelin that provides the insulation. And this is a degenerating nerve. And this is a nerve that remained intact. And it took another 10 years to figure out what was the genetic mutation. And it turns out that there's an enzyme called NMNAT1 that synthesizes a metabolite called NAD, which is an important precursor for generating energy for your cells. And then another mutation was identified in a different gene in the same pathway just 10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, 9 years ago, a different protein called SARM1. And this was done actually in flies. And the way the researchers, Mark Freeman and his group did this was really brilliant. What they did was they created thousands of mutant flies. And then they, one by one, pluck one of their nerve cells and ask if the axons degenerated. And they were looking at the mutants that where the axons didn't degenerate. And when they did that, they found that several of their mutants did not degenerate their axons for the life of the fly, which is about 50 days. And so they found that it was because of mutations in this one gene called DSARM. And there's a mouse or mammalian homologue called SARM1. We also have the same gene, same protein. And when you take that protein away, genetically delete that from the mice, their nerves don't degenerate. And we and others have now shown that deleting that gene makes the mouse very resistant to toxins or diabetes and so forth. So this is our current understanding of how the nerve cells degenerate in peripheral neuropathies. These are the two critical players, NMNAT and SARM1. When normally you have constant supply of NMNAT coming from your nerve cell body going through your axon, when you cut it, you quickly deplete the NMNAT, and then your SARM1 gets activated and your axon degenerates. In neuropathies, you have a problem with transport of that NMNAT or toxins that interfere with the turnover of NMNAT. So you create low levels of NMNAT in the most distal parts of your nerve. And that's why SARM1 gets activated and you have axon degeneration. As I said, several groups, including Stephanie Geisler in Aaron D'Antonio's group at Washington University, published the first paper in 2016 looking at a mouse model of chemotherapy-induced neuropathy. So it's very easy for us to model chemotherapy-induced nerve degeneration where we can't do it with the idiopathic neuropathy because we don't know how it happens or why or what caused it. But anyways, with the vincristine, you get this degeneration of the nerve cells in the skin, and in the mice where the SARM1 was deleted genetically, those don't degenerate. And we did the same thing with paclitaxel, which is again another cancer drug. We did it with diabetes. We basically fed mice high-fat diet. Basically, it's like that old movie, Super Size Me, giving them high doses of fatty meals. And these mice become obese and they develop diabetes and they develop neuropathy in the wild type. And so you can do a biopsy of their skin and show that their nerves are degenerating. And in the SARM1 knockout animals where we deleted the SARM1 gene, those animals didn't develop neuropathy. We tested it with one of the other cancer drugs called bortezomib. This is used to treat something called multiple myeloma. What is important is that irregardless of the toxin that you test, different chemo drugs, they all converge on this pathway, the NMNAT and SARM1. And so blocking this is so critical in preventing nerve degeneration. It also prevents it in the type 1 diabetes model, but it doesn't work for everything. We tested it in an inherited neuropathy model called CMT1A. And I'll skip that. The important thing is soon after that initial discovery, the realization that, SARM1, if it's a, we didn't know initially how it was initiating the axon degeneration. Why was it so important? I briefly mentioned that it's actually an enzyme. Normally, SARM1 in our nerve cells is present and it's in an inactive state. When it gets activated, it starts degrading the NAD. That's critical metabolite that's important for maintaining your energy levels in your nerve cells. And the nerve cells need that energy production so that they can conduct electricity. And that's how you sense things, and that's how you control your muscles. And so a company now published a paper just several months ago showing that they can actually develop small chemical inhibitors of this NAD degrading activity of the SARM1 enzyme. And they've demonstrated that they can block axon degeneration caused by either cutting the nerve or by giving another toxin called rotenone, which is an old a toxin to kill mice. And with the small molecule, they can block it, very similar to what they could achieve with genetically deleting the SARM1 protein. So I know of at least 3 different companies that are developing these small molecule inhibitors for SARM1, and they're basically racing to get to the clinics, hopefully in a year or 2. And they're going to be testing it in the chemotherapy-induced neuropathy patients. And the reason is, if I were to design a trial in a diabetic neuropathy patients, I will have to design it over 2-3 years because the nerve degeneration diabetes is very slow, and I won't get a clear answer very quickly. But in a chemotherapy situation, I know when the patients are going to get the chemo before their nerves are damaged, so I can give them a drug to protect their nerves and prevent that nerve degeneration. And I will get an answer in 6 months. So that's why all these companies are basically targeting cancer patients who are getting toxic chemotherapy to prevent the development of neuropathy in those patients. And if it works in those, I can guarantee you it will likely work in the diabetics and other types of peripheral neuropathies as well. It may not work for everybody, but it's going to be a big advance for the field. So again, this is kind of a summary slide of this whole pathway of, there's many other proteins that play a role in how activation status of these 2 enzymes are regulated, and I won't go into the detail on that. But I think one of the participants earlier posed a question: is there hope for us, for patients with neuropathy? And probably in my 20-year career, this is the best time to be hopeful. This identification of this enzyme and the ability to block its activation, I think, is going to be a game changer. So, Steve, maybe I can go ahead and do the Q&As.
Yeah, why don't you cover these, because these do cover the ones we got in advance.
Okay.
And then maybe also Pam Brown, if she's willing to ask her question too.
Sure. So I think there were 2 people who asked about postherpetic neuralgia and specific treatments and coping strategies for that. Postherpetic Post-herpetic neuralgia refers to persistent pain after you have a shingles. So unfortunately, this is not an easy disease to treat. Usually with the typical of neuropathic pain medications, we try either one of the anti-epileptic drugs or the antidepressants and maybe combine them. But sometimes using the topical solutions, such as those lidoderm patches or the compounded cream that has a bunch of drugs in it, such as ketamine, lidocaine, gabapentin, and so forth, might be actually helpful. So I would recommend that whoever has that, talk to their doctors about trying some of these topical solutions as well. The next question, I think, was the one that you posed.
Right.
Yeah. So do you know of any cases where the PN actually disappeared? So I think there are types of peripheral neuropathies where it will get better. The most prototypical one is the chemotherapy-induced neuropathy. So if I were to take 100 patients and give them paclitaxel, for example, for their breast cancer, about 80% of them will develop peripheral neuropathy. In 40%, it will be mild enough that after about 6 months to a year, their neuropathy will recover. And this is the reason for that is, as I mentioned, the peripheral nerves has the ability to regenerate, but they do it very slowly. Our human nerves can regenerate only about 1 inch a month. So over time, their neuropathy do get better and they can be back to normal. But the remaining 40% will have symptoms of neuropathy because the degeneration may have happened too far in, closer to the nerve cell body. And even if it tries to regenerate, it never makes it back to the skin. The other types is, some of you may heard of the disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome. This is basically an autoimmune condition. Your body is fighting the infection, such as a influenza virus, makes a mistake and attacks your nerves. Most often, this attacks the insulation. And when that happens, the body has the ability to repair the insulation, and the patients can recover almost fully. And some of those can be quite severe. I mean, I've had patients who were in a wheelchair and, 6 months to a year later, they're back to almost normal. Any of the idiopathic cases recover? Unfortunately, no, not that I have seen, and I can't think of a way of them recovering. Unless you refer to some of the autoimmune neuropathies or post-infectious neuropathies under the idiopathic category. So there are, besides the Guillain-Barré syndrome, there are other post-infectious neuropathies where the immune system, again, makes a mistake and attacks your nerves. But in the case of those, instead of attacking the myelin, it attacks the small sensory nerve fibers in your skin, and causes them to degenerate. These patients present with burning sensation throughout their whole body. But after about 6 to 9 months, the symptoms start to stabilize, and then over 2 to 3 years, they slowly recover. Supplements and peripheral neuropathy. This is a question I get asked all the time. Is there any diet or supplements that they can take? And the short answer is that, unfortunately, there's no good randomized clinical trial that showed that any of the supplements are better than placebo when you do a clinical trial. The problem is the placebo in these trials have an effect of 30 to 40%. That is, when I test to see if a drug is working and the patients are on placebo, about 30 or 40% of them tell us that their symptoms are better. So that's a problem with the supplements. And but because most of them have no side effects except to your wallet, I usually tell patients, if you want to try it, go ahead and take it. If it works even as a placebo, it's better than some of the other drugs that we use because they all have side effects. So I encourage patients to try out different supplements and see if any one of them works for them. And then the last question that came last was, this patient was diagnosed with small fiber neuropathy and with a skin biopsy and asked, does it make sense to be seen at an academic center? If your doctor did a thorough workup in terms of looking for the underlying etiology, then probably not. We're not going to be able to offer you anything different except perhaps educating the patient and going over the blood work that the patient had, making sure that things like prediabetes wasn't missed or vitamin deficiency, or if the patient has other underlying illnesses such as some of the rheumatological disease, for example, Sjogren's disease, that can cause small fiber neuropathy. If those have been evaluated, then probably not. And I think that was it from my end. Steve, you're muted.
While Steve is getting connected again, Pamela Gertz asked, can you talk about scrambler therapy and its effectiveness for PN?
Yeah, so that's a very good. So neuromodulation as a big category is quite interesting. The simplest of those is something called TENS, transcutaneous nerve stimulation. This is something that the pain physicians or pain doctors use for people with like low back pain. Scrambler therapy is kind of a more sophisticated version of that, but it basically uses electrical stimulation to quote unquote retrain your nerves so it learns to ignore the pain sensation coming from your peripheral nerves. Over the years, I've referred a couple patients to the physicians who use scrambler therapy. Maybe one or two had sustained relief, but the clinical trials are not that great. There's a subpopulation of patients who benefit from it, whether it's placebo or there's a true biological effect, we don't know. But it's not going to change the underlying nerve degeneration. It's just going to mask your symptoms the same way our drugs do. So if people wants to try it, I'm perfectly happy referring them. At Hopkins, there's a Dr. Tom Smith in Palliative Cancer Center who does it, but I'm pretty sure his schedule is quite booked.
Is there a definitive link between idiopathic small fiber neuropathy and Parkinson's disease? Has that been established?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So the reverse of it is actually, one thing we learned is about, when I was a medical student and resident 30 years ago, we never thought of Parkinson's disease patients having neuropathy. Mm-hmm. But the data from the last 10 years tells us that about 30% of Parkinson's disease patients actually have small fiber neuropathy. And in fact, now we can diagnose Parkinson's disease with a skin biopsy. We can actually stain them for some of the abnormal protein that are also present in the brain of the Parkinson's disease patients.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Pam Brown, would you like to talk about or ask the question that you submitted earlier? Pam?
Yeah, unmute.
Yes, this is Pam. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Hoke, your overview has been so really thorough and spectacular. You've probably addressed my question, but let me read you the letter anyway, okay? I just said, I'm a 74-year-old female recently diagnosed with peripheral neuropathy in both feet, and that was through the EMG NCS test this month. My symptoms are uncomfortable, but my mobility is normal. 7 years ago, I learned I was pre-diabetic. Since then, I've followed a low-carb diet with no diabetes meds. My most recent A1C was 5.7, which was a few days ago, in fact. I do everything right. I stay thin, keep to my diet, and exercise regularly. My doctors try not to sound pessimistic, but they didn't suggest any treatment except for medication to control pain if needed. And then I just, said, basically, I'm fighting discouragement. And is there any hope for cases like mine?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, one, there's hope on the horizon, but most importantly, keep up with the controlling your diabetes or pre-diabetes as good as you're doing. 5.7 is awesome.
Thank you.
A1C. That is really awesome.
Thank
The other thing is the exercise. I really can't emphasize how important the exercise is. We've published papers on this with the animal models. So if I take a mouse and put them on a treadmill for about an hour a day and make them diabetic or give them cancer drugs, they don't develop neuropathy. It is that strong an effect. And as I said, there's been now 4 clinical trials done, 2 of them in diabetic patients and 2 of them in pre-diabetic patients with neuropathy, very similar to what you have. And where they've done baseline biopsies, repeated it 6 months later, and this rigorous exercise regimen can slow the progression.
Well, that's very good news. And I've been doing the exercise online since COVID, which is so convenient, and I just love it.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I also have been doing Pilates with an instructor online. It's been great.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you so much.
This leads to DS's question. What is the exercise regimen that is helpful? And is it helpful chemo-induced as well?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Actually, there's right now a trial that University of Maryland is doing in chemo patients to see if it actually prevents the development of neuropathy. In the patients who have already developed chemo-induced neuropathy, the exercise can actually accelerate the recovery. So the exercise regimen, we don't know what's the minimum exercise. That's the big problem in our field. Like in cardiology, you can talk about cardiac benefits of exercise. Half an hour of aerobic exercise is good as 7 minutes of high-intensity interval training, for example. With the diabetic neuropathy trials, what's been done is much more time intensive. It's half an hour of aerobic exercise where you target your heart rate to about 40% of your baseline. So if your baseline heart rate is 70, you get on a stationary bicycle and get your heart rate to about 90, 95 beats per minute. That's about half an hour. The other half an hour, what was done in those studies was resistance training with weights. And again, when you work out big bulky muscle groups, your biceps, triceps, your quads, your hamstrings, those muscles are actually releasing proteins to the blood called neurotrophic factors. And we've shown this both in patients as well as in animals. And we don't know which one of those neurotrophic factors are critical for the health of the nerves, because each one of them, when we test them individually in mice, they all help the nerves. But in humans, we think it's a combination of those growth factors as well as increase in blood flow that is probably helping maintain the health of the peripheral nerves and also accelerate the nerve regeneration.
Thank you. And Jessica Clothier about glial cells has a question. Go ahead, Jessica.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoke. I had read an article about glial cells and research into pain, and I'm wondering if you can speak about that. I don't know if you happen to read the article, others did here.
Yeah,
so in the New York Times.
Yes, so this is a new paper that was published recently. So glial cells are what we call the supporting cells of the nervous system. In the brain, you have 3 different types of glial cells. In your peripheral nervous system, you have only the Schwann cells. So they do the job. The Schwann cells are the ones that make the myelin. What that paper is referring to is the pain sensation that you guys experience, even though it originates because of the degeneration in the peripheral nerve, all that has to travel through electricity up the spine into the brain before you can actually perceive it as pain. And one thing that happens in people with peripheral neuropathy is that sometimes the spinal cord, where those nerve cells are passing through, there is actually an activation of the glia, especially a subtype of glia called microglia. These are kind of the immune cells of the central nervous system. And when those are activated in peripheral neuropathy, and there's quite a bit of good literature on this in the chemo patients, even when the peripheral nerve actually recovers, and we've seen this in chemo patients, you do nerve conduction studies, it improves, the patient should be better, and yet they perceive constant pain. And that's because of this thing called central sensitization. And that pain is mediated through this activation of the glial cells in the central nervous system. Unfortunately, there's really no good way of blocking that. There is some preclinical data and some non-randomized kind of case series of a drug called naltrexone. Low dose naltrexone that might be used in those patients. As I said, we don't know if it's really doing what it's supposed to. I mean, in mouse models, it does reduce the activation of those microglial cells.
So glial cell, the pain research that's being done will help other people, but not neuropathic patients?
It can help with neuropathic pain patients too, but not everybody is going to have the same mechanism. One thing we know with the people with peripheral neuropathy and neuropathic pain is you can have kind of dysregulation of the pain pathways at multiple places. It starts in the periphery, but also in the cell body, in the spine, spinal cord itself, or even the brain sometimes have abnormal regulation of that pain sensation.
How do you spell glial? G-L-E-A-L?
No, G-L-I-A-L, and it's in the chat.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay.
Diane Mowat. Oh, go ahead.
What's the role of vitamin B12?
Yeah, so that's a very important thing. So vitamin B12 so most of your vitamins are basically what we call cofactors for some of the proteins that our cells need in order to function properly. So we can't produce vitamin B12 ourselves. We have to get it from our food. And B12 is absorbed through the stomach, and it's actually absorbed through the gut, but there's a cofactor that our stomach secretes that it's called intrinsic factor that binds to the B12 in the food and allows it to be absorbed. With normal aging, as we get older, our stomach lining atrophies and it stops making, or it has reduced amount of intrinsic factors. That's why vitamin B12 deficiency is much more common as we get older. And so people, without realizing, even if they eat a healthy, balanced diet, they can become vitamin B12 deficient. And vitamin B12 is critical for normal function of your nerve cells. Does that answer your question?
Partly. Can you be more specific? What's the mechanism of B12's functioning in the nervous system? Because the first thing that my neurologist detected when I went for an exam, it was low B12. I'm taking B12 now, and it seems that after 2 years, the progression of peripheral neuropathy was arrested. So what's the mechanism?
No, as I said, it is important for maintaining the health of normal function of your nerve cells. So if you're deficient in that, your nerve is not going to be able to function, and it's going to degenerate. And if you're taking it, you're replaced it. Depending on how severe the deficiency was and how advanced your neuropathy was, when you basically start taking B12 supplements, most patients see an improvement early on. But then, if the degeneration was well advanced, you're never going to recover back to fully normal. You can stop the progression at that point, and you will see some improvement, but your peripheral nerves are not going to regenerate all the way back.
Okay. Mark Siegelman has a question about the new research you discussed. Does it apply to demyelinating as well as axonal? And go ahead, Mark,
Yeah.
if you have additional.
Yeah, I can see the question in the chat.
Thank you.
The pathway that I mentioned with NMNAT and SARM1 doesn't apply to demyelination, because that's a totally different category of disease. There is actually interesting research happening in that field as well. Because most of the demyelinating diseases are autoimmune, there is drugs that are being tested in, for example, multiple sclerosis or other type of autoimmune rheumatological disease are being applied. So far, unfortunately, apart from one called rituximab, they really haven't panned out. The only good thing is we can use prednisone in those patients, which is a steroid that can help suppress the immune system. Obviously, you have all the side effects and complications of that. Any medical concern with constant fasciculations in calves? So the most common cause of fasciculations or twitches in calf muscles is actually back issues. So that L5S1 lumbar nerve pinching is probably the most common cause of fasciculations. So I would suggest anybody who has that, make sure they get an MRI scan.
Does that refer also to cramping, leg cramps?
Yep. So you can have it from neuropathy too, but because back issues are common, especially as we get older, I would definitely recommend an MRI scan in that situation, especially if it's one-sided only. Because typically neuropathy is going to be bilateral, but if it is only one, like years ago, I had a herniated disc L5S1, so my left calf and foot muscles always cramp very easily, and I have to take magnesium supplements and keep myself hydrated well to prevent that from happening.
Okay, thank you. Diane Malwitz, could you speak to PN without pain or numbness? Diane, this is a long question. Can you tell us what exactly you're asking about?
Yes, I have idiopathic neuropathy, and it's
the question with the erythromelalgia is an interesting one. So erythromelalgia is a relatively rare condition. For people who don't know it, basically the hands and feet turn almost like bright red, beet red, and it can be quite painful. And it happened episodically. It can be a genetic condition. There are mutations in a sodium channel, 3 different sodium channels so if you haven't been tested, you should get tested. I don't know how old you are, but usually it presents in patients in their younger years. It can be acquired in the sense that some of them actually can be autoimmune. So make sure you check with your doctor that they've done the appropriate workup for the erythromelalgia. But as you noted, some patients just have it in association with their neuropathy. And part of the problem is, neuropathy can also affect the autonomic nerve fibers that controls how your blood vessels constrict and responds to environmental stimuli. That is, like normally when you're in a cold environment, your blood vessels should open up so that your hand can warm up. But in patients with erythromelalgia, that process is dysregulated, and so the blood vessels open up when they're not supposed to in a warm environment, so your hand turns bright red.
Okay. We have one question about diet. Is there any connection
Thank you.
between high and low carb diets and PN?
Yes, so high carb diet is bad. That's the, stay away from ice cream and cakes. Yeah, and that's all I will say. It's, the best diet to follow, if you really want to follow something, is probably the Mediterranean diet with lots of vegetables, fruits, and fish, and easy on the red meat. I think that's the general health advice.
Okay. Michael Foxworth has a question about physical therapy metrics. Have any work been done with the physical therapy community to define standard metrics for progression of PN other than expensive skin biopsies or repeated EMGs? How can someone tell if their PN is stable or progressing?
So, careful neurological examination actually can document that. I mean, over the years, I've had some patients with idiopathic neuropathy where I still remember a couple of gentlemen who came to me after when this was about maybe 6-7 years ago, but after these first papers came out, I said, maybe you should exercise. And one gentleman from DC turned himself into a quote unquote gym rat, and he was in the gym an hour every day. And I hadn't seen him for about 3-4 years. And prior to that, his neuropathy was progressing. I could document this with my examination. And that visit, though, there was absolutely no change in his exam. The problem is, when you exercise, and because the neuropathy progresses so slowly, you're not going to see a change. You're not going to notice something, in 6 months or 3 months or 4 months. I think the motivation to exercise really has to come not just to see if you're getting better or not, but recognizing that the exercise is good for your overall health as well, not just for your neuropathy.
And Jessica, again, Clothio, does the hope you are talking about with the new clinical trials actually repair the axonal damage or only prevent it?
So it will only prevent it right now. But as I mentioned, the peripheral nerves have the capacity to regenerate. So our hope is that, even in somebody who has, let's say, if it's very advanced neuropathy, I don't think these drugs are going to reverse it. I'm going to be blunt with you guys. But if somebody has a mild neuropathy, we stop the disease progression, the peripheral nerves can regenerate like they do in, say, chemo patients.
Mike, are there any supplement studies available?
Supplement studies. As I said, there isn't any good, randomized placebo-controlled studies that have shown consistent benefit. There are tons of studies with, either no good placebo control or small studies, case series. You can easily do a Google search on PubMed for different supplements and neuropathy, and you'll find, what has been done and what hasn't been done.
There is a publication, isn't there, Mike Foxworth, if he's still on? We've talked about it in our other group that evaluates the efficacy of supplements. Have you heard about that? They try to evaluate quality and I don't know if they take into account clinical trials or not. Have you heard anything about that?
It's the Consumers Report you can subscribe for their report on various supplements, but we were told it was expensive and we don't know much about it.
Well,
We
it-
meaning DC Group.
it's-
Consumer Reports publishes it?
Yes.
It's called Consumer Labs, but what they're doing is testing to be sure that the supplement actually has the ingredients in it that they're supposed to have. It doesn't do research to see whether or not the supplement
Oh, okay,
causes
all right,
you to improve at any particular
okay,
disease. It
yeah,
just verifies that the supplement has the contents that it says it's supposed to have.
okay. Well, I guess that's the first step, but then beyond that, Dr. Hoke, you're not aware of anything that, really is attempting to study these randomly?
So, the NIH years ago, this is more than 10, 12 years ago, set up a separate institute to study alternative medicine. And they have done clinical trials like trying those things for osteoarthritis, Alzheimer's disease, like ginkgo biloba and so forth. And so these are very expensive, large clinical trials. And apart from modest effects, nothing really have panned out. And I'm not aware of any good study done through the NIH of the nutritional supplements in neuropathies, though.
Right. We recently identified over 300 grants that the NIH has made in recent years that relate to peripheral neuropathy. And we're in the process of trying to make a contact there and evaluate which ones are the most promising. Maybe we can consult with you and Dr. McCrae about that. We were surprised that there were that many studies on PN at the NIH had funded. Some of them are fairly small studies, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but there were a number of them over $1 million. Maybe you have some at your lab at Hopkins. Is that worth pursuing to see what the NIH is actually evaluating now?
Yeah, I mean, most of those are going to be very basic research studies, not testing individual drugs. I mean, I think if you find the ones, go through them and find the ones that are focusing on drug testing, I think that might be helpful.
Okay.
And I know the Foundation for Peripheral Neuropathy also has useful information about nutritional supplements as well as these trials. And the other good website is clinicaltrials.gov. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. So any decent clinical trial needs to be registered with the NIH's website called clinicaltrials.gov. So whether it's a pharmaceutical company doing it or an individual researcher, so you can see what has been done there as well.
Okay, thank you. Pat, is that on questions? I think we should wrap it up soon.
There is one more. Mike Foxworth, are you still on asking your question about who if you're a non-specialist, how can you read? Are there articles? Go ahead, Mike. Where can you find out information?
One of the problems I've had, I've been working on this for like 6 years now. I've done a lot of reading and stuff, try to digest this stuff down so that it can be put into just words for people who aren't experts and they're just regular patients. We find that the doctors, regular primary care doctors, tend to not know very much about PN. Are there articles in development, or have they been published somewhere that are at the level of reading level that say a typical primary care doctor could read without being a specialist and not necessarily knowing all of the names of all these enzymes and not necessarily having great depth of understanding about exactly how nerves work? Is there publications either in progress or have already been published that people like me could read and say, oh, I think I understand this. Let me try to explain it to you. I've struggled for 6 years trying to find something. I've never found anything that takes this latest research and tries to put it in language that is more accessible.
So are you asking about research or just kind of what peripheral neuropathy is and how to cope with it and so forth? Because there's been a couple good books written by physicians who have neuropathy. And one of the one that I recommend to patients is, it's been a while, I think it's called Numb Toes, Aching Soles.
Doctor, is that by Norman Leitoff or?
No, not Norman Leitoff. Let me see if I can find it on Amazon.
We'll look it up while you take the last question. How is
Let me just follow-
Lermidis?
If I can, just let me follow
Go
up.
ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
One of the things is you're describing research results that are fairly recent, that are very helpful, and yet the word has not gotten out to this community. And so when I say articles, it's a lot faster to have articles published in something like Scientific American or other venues, and there can be a disconnect between your perspective of your sense of hopefulness and what the patient community senses from their physicians, because the physicians they're not being presented with information that they can convey to their patients.
Yeah, no, you're right. But what I'm describing today really is so new that if you ask 90% of neurologists, forget primary care doctors, neurologists in the country, they wouldn't have heard it.
Right.
So, you know, we've written review papers on this. In fact, you know, but again, the review paper that we just published last year with my collaborator from Cambridge University, Michael Coleman, who identified the NMNAT1 gene, was, you know, it's geared towards the scientific community. But I'm happy to share it with you guys. I can send it to Steve, and if Steve wants to send it around, you know, it will give you, you know, whatever you can get from it.
Okay.
But you're right. I mean, Mike, I like your idea. Maybe if I can find some time, write something for Scientific American that maybe a general population can understand.
We can call it, you know, nerve breakthroughs for dummies or something.
No. It's you know, Scientific American was my lifeline in when I was in middle school and high school. That was the, you know, journal I always look forward to seeing in my library.
The book, I think, is Numb Toes and Aching Soles by John A. Seneff.
Yep, that's the
And
book.
That's in the chat for those who are interested in looking for it. And I promised the last question was to Mike, who asked about how is Lermidis sign related to neuropathy?
Yeah, so Lermidis sign is something that actually we see in people with multiple sclerosis. It's due to loss of the insulation or myelin in the spinal cord and has nothing to do with the peripheral nerves.
Okay, and I forgot one other person. I apologize. Ellen or Aline, is there any correlation between PN and Raynaud's?
Not a direct correlation, but Raynaud's is an autoimmune condition seen in rheumatological diseases. So when I see a patient with Raynaud's and neuropathy, I do a much thorough workup, search for Sjogren's, lupus, sarcoid, and so forth. So make sure whoever has that problem has a thorough evaluation, because if you treat the underlying rheumatological condition, their neuropathy can be stopped.
I have one residual question I've always asked: the connection between taking statins and neuropathy. I've read conflicting information about this over the years, that some European studies show there is a direct connection of drug-induced neuropathy from taking statins. And you haven't studied that, have you?
We haven't studied directly, but I've reviewed the literature, and you know, a lot of those studies that show some relationship, didn't do a good control cohort. So those are called case control studies, and the control groups weren't very good. And if you ask the people who specialize in peripheral neuropathies, almost all of them will tell you there's no really causal relationship between statins and peripheral neuropathies.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
thank you all for your questions. I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and a huge thank you to Dr. Hoke.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Presentation
Bye,
and
guys.
response to our questions.
Yeah, and tell Dr. McCrae we'll get in touch with him also going forward. So we plan to meet the third Thursday of each month at 7 p.m. So the next meeting of this group will be on Thursday, December 16th at 7. We don't have a speaker, but we'll have an opportunity, depending on how many people we have, for everybody to speak and share information and get ideas for treatments and diagnoses and doctors and what have you. After tonight, you're going to receive an email about that meeting with a Zoom link to register. You'll also receive a link to the recording and also an evaluation form, which we urge you to submit to evaluate tonight's program, as well as some questions we have. What specific PN issues are you coping with in terms of pain, numbness, treatments, doctors? What you hope to get out of the group? What additional questions you may have? Any recommendations for future speakers? We look forward to hearing back from you. And finally, Suburban policy is not to make publicly available your email address when you register for their programs, but they say it's okay